Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's public program, The Vanishing, Tracing the Journey from Novel to Film. My name is Gabriel Sanders, and I am the public program's producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Now in its 25th year, the museum is committed to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you for joining us today virtually. We hope you will visit the museum in person to see our new core exhibition, The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do, alongside our temporary exhibitions, Boris Lurie, Nothing to Do But to Try, running through November 6th, and Survivors, Faces of Life After the Holocaust, photographs by Martin Scholler. Learn more and find tickets on our website. We appreciate the vital support of our members here at the museum. If you want to get closer to the museum and enjoy exclusive programs, member previews to exhibitions, and free admission, you can explore museum membership on our website or email membership@mjhnyc.org to learn more. Closed captions are available on today's program. Instructions on how to turn captions on or off will be posted in the chat, in addition to the links I've mentioned. If you have questions for our speakers, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Though I will be off camera during the program, I'll be here in the chat for any thoughts, questions, or needs. In a blend of history, fiction, and magical realism, The Vanishing is a new novel from David Michael Slater. The book traces how one girl, as a result of witnessing a brutal murder, turns invisible to save her best friend from the horror of Nazi Germany. David is joined in conversation by Jay Lender and Susan Dubin. In addition to the content of the book, today's conversation will address David's process of writing the novel and how Jay plans to make it into a film. David Michael Slater is an acclaimed author of nearly 30 books of fiction and nonfiction for children, teens, and adults. He teaches in Reno, Nevada, and I will post a link to David's website to learn more about his work. Jay Lender is an Emmy-nominated writer, director, and artist, and an original crew member for the classic first 3 seasons of Nickelodeon's SpongeBob SquarePants, the Nosferatu gag. That was his. He also wrote, directed, and composed songs for 2 seasons of Disney's Ingenious, Phineas and Ferb. He has worked in video games and comics on properties as diverse as Looney Tunes, The Duke of Hazzards, and The Sopranos. His original novel, Duster, with frequent collaborator Micah Wright, is a feminist.
Don't oversell it. We're good.
The World War II era home front action story. All right. Susan Dubin is the library director and education specialist at the Sperling Kronberg Mack Holocaust Resource Center in Las Vegas. She teaches professional development classes for the Clark County School District and writes classes for the Nevada State Department of Education. And I know she's used The Vanishing in her teaching. Thanks so much for attending today. I will hand it over to Susan.
Welcome, everybody. It's nice to have you visit with us. And Jay and David, we're especially happy to hear a little bit more about you and the process that you're using in bringing this book to life. So let's start with finding out a little bit more about you. David, can you share a little bit about your background?
Sure, thanks Susan, thanks Gabriel. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this book. So I'm a teacher. I've been teaching middle school mostly, a little bit of high school for the last, 25 years. First and mostly in Portland, Oregon, and then the last 10 years here in Reno. And all that time I've been publishing books, pretty much for every age bracket, almost every age bracket, picture books, chapter books, middle grade books, young adult books, novels for adults, and a couple works of nonfiction. And that's pretty much my story.
Thank you. Jay, how about you? What's your background?
I was raised in New Haven, Connecticut. My family was in the bagel business. I'm one of those lenders. So even though we were, sort of raised conservative Jewish, We did Kiddush on Fridays. We went to high holiday services. We were not very religious, but we were deep, deep into Jewish culture because of the business we were in and the community we were part of. So even though I've been other places and done other things, cartoons and whatnot, this feels like a natural fit for me. Glad to be here and working on this.
Yeah, Jay's inspired me to give a little more that I left out. I'm originally from Pittsburgh,
Please.
Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Grew up in a family that attended a conservative shul, not particularly observant outside of that. And I'm a lifer at Camp Vermont. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, the one that in Canada. So that's my lifelong connection here.
So I went to Camp Ramah when I was a teenager, and my children went as well. So, but the one in California.
Ojai, right?
Yes, Ojai. So how did you and Jay meet, David?
All right. I'll tell my side of it, and Jay
Yes.
can tell his side of it. So over the years, I've had agents, but none of them have ever sold my work. They're all great people. They all tried. And maybe this is a different conversation, but at some point I sort of took over trying to get my work published. And that eventually transferred over to trying to get my work adapted for film once it was published. So I reach out to a lot of people all the time. And pretty much everything good that's happened in my career has been the result of some sort of happenstance or luck, whatever you want to call it. And in one of these cases, I sent my novel Fun and Games, which is a 1980s comic drama about a dysfunctional family in Pittsburgh who's sort of affected generational trauma-wise by the Holocaust. And I got it to somebody who knew Jay. So they passed on the book, and I got an email saying, hey, I know someone who might be interested in this book, and they passed it to Jay. Sometime later, when I'm sure I'd completely forgotten about that submission.
2 years later.
Was it?
It was
Okay.
years.
So years later, that submission was on a list somewhere, I'm sure. Anyway, I get an email from Jay saying he read the book, he loved the book, he's interested in the book. And correct me if I'm wrong, there was a note in there that said, let me share my take on the story. And, you know, if you're interested and it's in alignment with the way you're thinking, then maybe we can do something here. So Jay sent me his reading on the book, and it blew me away. I'm pretty sure I wrote back that your summation of it and its themes is better than I could do. So he wrote a screenplay, hasn't sold yet, but it's wonderful. And since that point, we've been collaborating on various projects. Does that line up?
It does. I'll just add that David is a fearless cold caller. There's nobody high or low that he won't get on the phone with. And people that, you know, if I were to look at some of these people, I would burst into flames. They're so big in my industry, but it means nothing to him. He calls and they take the call because he's a novelist. You know, they would never take my call for a million different reasons in their industry, and I'm an animation guy, but I think they're all so thrilled to be on the phone with an actual writer that, you know, from their point of view, that they take the call. But the one that he made to my friend was to the low end. This is a guy, a wonderful guy I love, who has been working in production for 30, 40 years. And I once developed an animated show for him, and he sent me the letter from David, and he's like, I don't know what to do with this guy. Do you want him? And I said, sure, I'll do it. But I was on a plane to go visit my kids who live in Massachusetts at the time, and it just scrolled away. 2 years later, I finally was going through old email and rediscovered it. And when I read the book, there was so much about it that resonated with me. I mean, the time period, the character, this, you know, kid who's trying to keep his head down in a, for lack of a better term, exceptional family with a sort of middling famous father. It spoke to me. I mean, this was my life. So I think I got it in a way that maybe not a lot of other people would. And while, the movie industry is changing a lot right now, nobody really knows what's going on or where the safe place is to put their money. The time hasn't come yet for that movie and for the subsequent novel of David Sparks, which I also have adapted. But the moment will come for those. The moment for The Vanishing, though, is now and always.
That brings me to my next question. Why were you drawn to this particular story of The Vanishing now?
Well,
Or David, we'll start with you.
okay. Long answer, a short answer, then a long answer.
Okay.
Because I've become aware of I think there's my very simple conscious motive, and then having written the book, it occurs to me that I had some other things in mind. So the very, looking back over my history of work, the Holocaust recurs a lot. I've had to reflect on that lately. I'm not entirely sure why, but it appears in Fun and Games. It appears in Sparks, which is a sci-fi fantasy thing with modern Nazis. It pops up in my 7-book teen series, fantasy series called Forbidden Books. And then all of a sudden, so I wrote Sparks, The Vanishing, and now I'm working on a musical about the Milgram shock experiments, which you may be familiar with. Is basically designed to see why people were so obedient, why the German citizens were so obedient to the Nazis. So it kind of feels like I'm preoccupied. Again, I'm not entirely sure why. I don't have any knowledge of connections to the Holocaust other than as, someone who's Jewish. But honestly, when I started this book, it was just a compelling idea. I think I threw it out to Jay as a possible movie without even a book existing, which was, wouldn't it be an amazing story if someone were invisible during the Holocaust? And when I started the book, that's all. I just thought that would be a compelling, dramatic story one way or another. And that's why I started the book. No other motives. Having written the book now and having received feedback and read reviews, there's some other things that occurred to me. One of the first reactions I got, I sent it to a former professor named Arthur Shostak. Amazing guy. He wrote me back and he explained to me why he liked the book so much. He has this really interesting theory that he's been pushing for years, that we're making a mistake in the way we teach the Holocaust strictly through what he calls the horror story, which he says absolutely has to be taught. But he thinks we're making a mistake that we leave out what he calls the helping story. And he sent me his book called Hidden Altruism. And that resonated with me strongly. And I realized that is part of what I was doing in this book, intentionally looking back. I didn't want to just depict the horror story. And it's gratifying for me to hear from the feedback that, as devastating as some people say the book is, they also find it inspiring because it has both the worst and best of humanity in it. So there's that. And then, now that it's been written and I see reactions, we all know the statistics on knowledge about the Holocaust are abysmal. I think the last time I saw a survey, it was like 75% of the US, 50% of the world, or actually reverse that, don't know it existed. So, it may not have been my intent, but it would certainly be wonderful if this book gets noticed enough to start conversations and reach people that might not otherwise ever have any interest in the entire Holocaust. So that's the longer answer.
Thank you. Jay, how about you? What drew you to this idea?
Well, I'll give you the flip answer first, and that's that I feel like this is on the verge of becoming a blockbuster, and I'm happy to ride David's coattails to the next phase of my career. But I think the bottom line here is it's a great story. It's also a story that needs to be told, and you only have to look out into the street, and they're marching and chanting, "The Jews will not replace us." We have people who espouse the ideas of Nazis if they don't actually wave a Nazi flag in state legislatures and in Congress. If not now, when? If we don't find a new way to reach people and a way to reach new people, we're going to be talking about the next genocide, and which is not to say there have not been genocides since 1945. There have, but this could be our last chance in Europe and in America to use this as the example. And I just can't imagine why we wouldn't want to do more, because when you look at the world as it is today, clearly the way we've been dealing with this topic has not resonated enough. I can't sit here and tell you that it's not good, that we haven't made progress, but if we are where we are right now, we haven't done the job. So we need to find new ways to talk to people about this. And I think that this story and the conceit of this story, that Sophie, the main character, is invisible and cannot be heard, will grab audiences that might otherwise feel like they're being lectured to. And there's a, I think everyone has a little bit of apprehension that we're veering toward entertainment here, and that we're, reflecting superhero movies. And is it respectful to talk about this issue through this kind of magic realist lens? And I think whatever gets you the results is what is the respectful thing to do. And just to clear up a term, we say magic realism, but when this movie is finished and you go to the theater, I wouldn't go expecting to see, Jodorowsky or something like that. There's really just the one element of fantasy in it, and that is that Sophie cannot be seen or heard. But it's not a ghost story. It's not about, things levitating. There will be a few moments, because the whole story is told from the point of view of Sophie. And Sophie can see herself, and she can perceive herself, and she can hear herself. So we, seeing the story through her eyes, can do the same. But there are a few moments, and you can count them on one hand, where we look at things through someone else's eyes. And in those moments, very sparingly, there will be an element of the fantastic. The rest of it, though, feels very much like objective reality.
That brings me to one of my key questions. David, why did you make Sophie invisible? What led you to make your main character someone that could not be seen by the others? And how did that affect your plot?
Sure. Well, just let me back up and add one statement to what Jay was saying. Right here in Washoe County, it's 2022, and we have a wealthy guy who's moved from California specifically to influence local politics, and he literally is going around quoting the protocols of the elders of Zion as proof that Jews are, the problem. I mean, this is like this week.
Yes.
Okay, so obviously, this conversation has to happen one way or another, like now, whether it has anything to do with my book or not. Okay, so again, I feel like I have multiple answers to all these questions, and the first one is one that some people probably wouldn't love, which is that she's invisible, because that is, I feel like it's a very powerful symbolism that's open to various interpretations. Some readers don't like that in a book. I've already just received feedback and reading people's reviews, and the way they read the invisibility are just very different, and sometimes really clever and wonderful and different. That said, I think I'd be willing to state that the way I look at it in part is that the vanishing represents her loss of safety, her loss of her family, her loss of her known way of life, the loss of her people, the loss of the memories of these people, and relevant to our last question, the potential loss of the complete memory of the Holocaust. So that's some of the ways, only some. I think there are other things, and it's also a really terrific plot device, because also some of the feedback I hear is that what's different, I really am amazed and happy to hear and read in reviews people saying, "Oh, I'm lifelong addicted to reading books about World War II and the Holocaust, but I've never read anything quite like this." In the way it captures so much of the picture in such a short space. And I think that's because of that plot device. It allows her to go into these areas which might be completely separate, unoverlapping stories if they were literal memoirs. Yeah, so it's both rich as a plot device and as a metaphor. And I'm sure if we let Jay answer, he's going to say different stuff, and that'll prove my point.
Maybe some extra stuff. You're right, though. I mean, from a practical standpoint, the value here is that Sophie is able to have all of the wartime experiences, or at least a much greater, broader variety of them. She goes from the shtetl to the ghetto, to the camps, to the woods fighting with the partisans, and then beyond. Whereas, Diary of Anne Frank can only tell us what it's like in the attic, and some other story may only give us another little slice. The invisibility, the great thing about the invisibility, or the interesting thing about the invisibility, is that, one of the reasons why you do this now is that I think it grabs a young audience that likes stories that have this kind of supernatural, or I'll use the word superpowered, quality to it. But if it's a power, her power is not so much in being unseen as it is in seeing, because by being unseen, she's allowed to be in all of these places and witness, and we are all very big on the term witnessing, everything that happened, and communicate all of that to the audience, to future generations. It's a really unique way to approach this story. And I think, the time is right to fictionalize this kind of thing so that we can reach an audience that doesn't want to be lectured to, and historically has not wanted to be lectured to, or to even look at this. It's a miserable time period. I mean, there's no version of this story that people want to experience. So you have to find ways to draw them through it. And I think that The Vanishing does that really spectacularly well.
Okay, so
as a film-
sorry, let me just say I love that, and that does prove my point, because when you just said that her real power is seeing, not being invisible, that strikes me as absolutely true, but it has not occurred to me.
Yeah.
So I love that.
It enables her to be an omniscient narrator without being separated from the reader as somebody is who is reading a novel that is only told from the third person point of view.
Right.
So, Jay, let me ask you, how as a filmmaker are you going to be able to handle having your main character not seen?
Well, she will be seen by us. Like I mentioned before, she can see herself. She is present. She knows she's present, and it's her movie. So we'll always see her. And the very simple version of it is she's going to be out of the way. And if she's in the way, she's going to step out of the way. And the other actors will simply treat her as though she's not there, because their characters don't know she's there. There are moments when there will be some tension because of that. She's certainly not floating, but she's not a floating presence here who gives us access. There are stakes for her. There are worries for her. She's going to be concerned that she'll be giving herself away or creating problems for other people. But it's not a preoccupation of the movie that she's invisible. What she's preoccupied with, and by extension what we're preoccupied with, is trying to stop what's happening around her, and specifically trying to protect her best friend, Giddy, the young boy who lives next door in the duplex in her town in Germany. She makes a vow when she turns invisible at the beginning that her job here for the rest of the war, however long it takes, is going to be to protect this kid. So that's what we're focusing on, not so much whether she's invisible. I think, there are a couple of moments here and there where she'll have to slide in just as a door closes, and we may make an issue out of how she gets food or how she gets to and from one place to another. But we're not going to spend a lot of time on it because it's, eventually it just becomes business, and it's a distraction from what matters, which is the emotion and the worries and the drama of what's going on around her.
So that brings me to another one of my questions, her relationship with Giddy. That was one of the more interesting parts of the book for me, because most books that talk about the rescuers talk about non-Jewish rescuers. And the fact that she is a Jewish girl who protects Giddy is a very different take than you usually get in novels. How did you come up with that idea, David?
Well, first I'll refer again to Professor Shostak, because that's another one of his missions, is to remind people of just how much altruism existed in the ghettos and in the camps and everywhere by Jews. They weren't only like the capo. We have a capo who's depicted as pretty corrupt, and you hear stories about thieving and everyone out for themselves, which I think is a disservice, and that's what he argues too. But actually, Giddy wasn't born for that specific reason. When I started writing the book, so Jace almost referred to the fact that many of the interventions that Sophie attempts do not either fail or make things worse. And when I started the book and was just not even very far into it, but envisioning that idea, I thought, you know what, who's going to keep reading this book, right? It's just going to be, all these characters are going to be lost along the way. Who are they going to care about except Sophie? And then they're going to be worn out if she constantly fails. So I thought, if she can't help change the course of history, which is one of the issues of the book, she could certainly help somebody. And so that need for that somebody is where Giddy came from. And then he just sort of grew into who he became as I wrote it, and his own character, with his own resilience and his own courage and bravery, despite being small and so cute that nobody takes him too very seriously, to his great frustration.
Okay, Jay, how about you? How do you look at Giddy as a character?
I think Giddy is fantastic. Everyone who goes through this experience, every character who goes through this experience has to wrestle with the same issue. And this sort of comes to a head during the partisan section late in the story. And that is, what are we willing to do? How are we willing to compromise ourselves to make things better or keep things from getting worse? And who are we going to be when this is all over with? And as a small boy, he's, I think, 8 years old or so when the story gets started, Giddy feels it more than most, because he's just coming into the part in his life where he would have any influence on anything. And we've dumped World War II in his lap. So, where normally kids would be thinking, hey, I'll make macaroni and cheese tonight, and that'll be my level of responsibility. He's thinking, how can I destroy the Nazis and stop the war? And Sophie is trying to protect that macaroni and cheese upbringing, for lack of a better term, for Giddy. By the time you get to the partisan section, in order to move forward, everyone has to do and see things that are really awful. There's no longer any compromising with the war and with the Nazis like you did on the way down in the ghetto, where we can give up a little bit and maybe we get a bigger ration. Once the camps have begun, there's no compromise, and everyone has to face this problem where I used to be a college professor, and now I'm going out and killing people because that's what it takes to come out of this experience. Giddy begins the book, in Hollywood we would say he's like the MacGuffin. He's the thing that everyone is keeping track of, but he becomes more of a character more as he tries to become more proactive as the story goes on. And it's fantastic, and the track that he follows is great, and where he ends up is amazing.
So David, that brings me to my question about the Partisans. You talk a lot about the Partisans in that last section in the book, and I was wondering, where did you get your research on that type of resistance?
So I'm sort of haphazard in my learning in general, and I have been exposed to Holocaust education in a somewhat haphazard way since I was like, I don't know, 9 years old in Hebrew school. So this book really represents everything that stuck, everything that struck me as profound and unforgettable. Those were the ingredients. So I knew the Partisans. I know a little bit about the Partisans, and I don't know from where and who and how, but that information has accumulated for me. So it wasn't until I started writing the specifics that I just had to go find research, and I started digging through the internet and finding firsthand accounts here or there that would, for example, I don't know exactly how they would build the dugout that they hide in, and wasn't sure what would happen. I knew they had fires in there, but I wasn't sure how that would not kill them all. So just little things like that, the details that I needed to tell the story I was already going to tell is what I dug around for. No pun intended. And it just sort of accumulated that way. I didn't have one resource or one special or significant account, just little pieces here and there, put it all together. And, I should say that I was very nervous with this book. I had no idea if it would work out, if everybody would despise it, or, it takes, I guess we should discuss at some point the fact that it takes liberty with some of the facts. There's a note at the end where I acknowledge that these, for the purposes of efficient storytelling, I set the ghetto and the camp and the woods all in Germany where they would not have been. But I didn't want to depict anything that happened in any of those locations that wasn't entirely plausible, if not accurate, a reflection of something that did happen on record. So I lost my thread. Where I was going with that. My point was that I wanted the partisan scene to reflect reality as much as I could. And I just tried to, here's where I was going with that. So I was so nervous when I originally finished this book that I sent it out. Even as I was sending it to publishers, I was reaching out to people in the field, published authors of Holocaust novels or Holocaust nonfiction, professors. And not only did I get good reactions, even more valuable, some of them made some corrections and suggestions and some fixes for me. So that was another way for that research to accumulate.
So Jay, David said that he's setting the whole story in Germany. Is that where you're going to set the movie as well?
Yeah, I'm not deviating from the book in ways like that. I think that makes perfect sense, although we don't make a big issue out of the fact that it's Germany in the movie. It's just a detail that doesn't really matter in terms of screen presentation. I went with David's research on all of this because in the end, he's told the story he wants to tell, and my job is to come up with a visual media version of that story. So there's a little bit of research that I do here and there. I mean, A, just to get in the spirit of the times, and B, to find out what vehicle they would be driving here, and what are German rank insignias and stuff like that when those things come up. But my job is not so much accuracy as, because this is not, it's not a documentary. My job is making sure that the story comes across right, and that in the transition to visual media, it still feels like the novel does. And it's, it's a dicey business. And forgive me if I'm getting ahead of your questions. I feel like I keep getting ahead of all of your questions. It's one thing to read about child experimentation. It's another thing to see it. So that idea is going to make an appearance in the movie, but the visual will not, because we can't have people running, screaming from the theater in revulsion. Then the story never comes across and the message never gets through to people. So figuring out what you can show, how you can show, so that I don't, there's a risk, for instance, with these horrors, that you veer into horror territory and that it becomes fetishized, or that on the other side of the scale, I undersell it. That's the last thing that I want to do is sanitize the horror. So figuring out how to land on all of these things, what can be shown, what should be shown, what needs to be shown, that's the job. And then how to show it so that I get the reaction that I need to get from the audience. That's my job. And as always, David will read the screenplay, and there will be things that he doesn't recognize, and there will be things that he sees in a new way because they have to be presented in a new way. It's a different medium, and the best way to tell a story isn't always to transcribe visually.
Thank you. How are you going to, other than the invisibility of Sophie, how are you going to imbue the story with the sense of magical realism that was really throughout the book? It was a feeling that you got when you read it, that these things were happening, but there was a deeper connection. Is that something you can translate into the film?
I feel like if I'm matching the tone of the book, then that's there. But for what it's worth, any efforts that I take to get to that place or to any place, if I find a way, excuse me, to sort of thread this needle, there's a director who's going to come after me, and I'm not going to be the director of this movie. And that person is going to have to do it again. And in a different way, because now they have to wrangle actors and cameras, and there are all kinds of things. All I can do is provide a roadmap. And I feel like it's there. I'm not sitting there with a checklist thinking, have I accomplished magical realism with this scene? I'm just telling the scenes as they are, filmically. And I think it's going to be where it needs to be. The question is, will the director get it into the end zone? And the answer is, no matter what they do, it will be something that none of us are expecting, because it is film as a director's medium. So I don't know what's going to happen. What would be the difference if Sophie is played by one actor or another actor? Anything can happen. They'll discover things along the way. I've made movies that's part of the process. And as long as everyone is aiming toward the same place and the same feeling, I'm actually very excited to see what will be brought to it that I didn't bring to it.
So let me ask you, who do you see as your audience for this film?
David?
Oh, well, I'll speak for the book, and I don't really imagine that it's different. So I'll back up and talk about the fact that it's marketed as a young adult book. There's a warning in the front that it may not be appropriate for younger or sensitive readers of any age. It's really a tricky discussion because I don't think I wrote this book saying this is for teenagers. I just wrote the book as it is. And when we were done and the discussion came up with the publisher, we were kind of on the fence about going either way with that. But essentially, it's partly just a marketing decision because the market says, fair or unfair, that if your protagonist is a teenager, then it's a young adult book. I mean, there are exceptions. And then once we decided to put that warning in the front, everybody was comfortable with it. But my worry is there are many adults who won't touch a young adult book. just simply for that reason. And I hope that's not the case, because for me, it's really for the most mature young people all the way up to adults. There's absolutely nothing about this book, in my opinion, that would make an adult not appreciate, not feel like it's, for them. So I hope that's the same case with the movie. I hope everybody who's mature enough to see this story of any age will see it.
Is that how you feel, Jay?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think it's exactly the same way with the movie. There's no way to do justice to this book or to this topic and make this story for a very young audience. It's just not going to happen. But young adults, and I don't know where that kicks in, a very mature 12 and up, if I had to guess, those people need to see a story about this. They need to be exposed to the upper limits of human cruelty and what really happened during World War II, even though this is a fictionalized account. There's a movie, an animated movie from Japan called Grave of the Fireflies. And because it's an animated movie and because Americans are not accustomed to adult animation that isn't just about sex and violence, a lot of Americans mistakenly let their children watch this movie, and it is not a movie for kids. And there are echoes of this story in that story, in that it's about children going through a horrific time. It's about two orphans in Japan during World War II who are just abandoned by society. And it is one of the most brutal movies I can imagine watching it. When the first time I saw this movie, when it was done, I turned it off and sat immobile for 15 minutes in silence, just trying to figure out whether I could continue with my day. And you then expect to not get anything done for a day or two after that, because it's really rough to watch children suffer, to watch anyone suffer. I would give the same warning for The Vanishing. This is not for little kids. But by the time you're 12, 13, you'd better be watching something like this. I think they need to know. They need to know early. They need to know before they can vote. They need to know before we start repeating history.
Madeline L'Engle said that there's no such thing as a book for children or a book for adults. There's only a good book or a bad book. And for me, The Vanishing is definitely a good book. My reaction to it after reading it was similar to your reaction to that film. I just had to breathe for a few minutes because it was just very moving. And one of the things about the book that I found especially wonderful is how easy it was to relate to all of the characters. David, how do you accomplish something like that as an author? How do you make your characters, who obviously were not real people, seem so alive and so real?
Well, I don't know that I can sum that up, except that I guess I could just say it happens in revision. Usually when they first appear on the page, they serve some function. And then as I rewrite and rewrite, I start to differentiate them. I usually want every character to have their own motivation that distinguishes them, and then quirks to their personality that make them unique. It might be the way they speak, it might be the way they eat, it might be the way they dress, but something that differentiates them from the other character. And just to repeat what I said, I think when they really become alive for characters, for readers, when they have their own agendas, and then you can see how those interact. Even these partisans who are literally trapped underground have different reasons for being there, that make them very different people.
So what other films have influenced your filmmaking over the years, Jay?
Like anyone my age, I grew up in the 70s and 80s. Early Spielberg was a big deal for me. Close Encounters in particular the unbelievable sense of wonder. And now as an adult going back and watching it, the fact that all the stakes are essentially internal is kind of shocking and amazing filmmaking. I'm just so impressed by that movie still. And I love it. But the movie, and of course, cartoons were the biggest deal for me. That's where I started my career in Hollywood, in writing, everything, comic books. I did all of that stuff and continue to love that. The media are great. The question is the story good? So you find good stories where you can. But I think the movie that grabbed me most, and this is, even though I've gone through film school, and in film school, you see everything, foreign films and silent films and films from every genre, you get a really broad experience. But the movie that grabs me the most, maybe not the best movie, but my favorite movie, is called The Stuntman. It's a 1980 movie by Richard Rush. It stars Barbara Hershey and Peter O'Toole and Steve Railsback, a couple of other people you'd know. And the very quick version of the story, I'll give it to you right now, is this. A criminal on the run crashes onto a movie set and accidentally is responsible for killing a stuntman. And in order to keep from losing his location, the director convinces this fugitive to pretend to be the stuntman for the duration of the shoot. But as they continue on, the stunts keep getting more and more dangerous. And this criminal starts to wonder, what's going on here? When this is over, the director needs a body. He needs to have a dead stuntman. So paranoia is the topic, and it is absolutely unclassifiable in terms of genre. It's a comedy, it's a drama, it's an action movie, it's a romance. It plays with your sense of reality constantly, and I can't get enough of it. Incredibly quotable. You can watch it over and over again. And if you want to know where I'm coming from, that's the movie to watch, The Stuntman.
I remember that movie. I remember it. I've seen it once back in the 80s, and I remember loving it.
Mm-hmm.
So David, how about you? What books or authors were influences on your writing?
So the easy answer is I literally started writing when I put down Ficciones by Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentine magical realist. I don't know if you could call him the father of it, but one of the fathers of it for sure. And he only did short stories, but I remember putting down one of them and having to sit there and with my head spinning and just trying to understand how he managed to create a feeling of what he called irreality. And awe is what I felt, which I think he's going for. And his influences in almost all of my work, except maybe the picture books, but maybe even some of them. So he was concerned with questions of infinity and time. And he had a brilliant way of introducing just the one single magical element and otherwise treating everything else as realistic as possible. So there's that. And as far as Jewish magical realism, I can't say he's not recognized, but I think criminally not enough. Steve Stern, author of he won the National Jewish Book Award, but I think he's one of the best living writers. And his books just are suffused with magic, not just one element, like all the way through, and all the Jewish legends. And it's just, they blew me away. So I think, the combination of those two, probably, I never thought of it consciously, but probably Tarantino's movie, Inglourious Bastards, had to be in my mind, because I remember just the sheer pleasure of the revenge happening in that kind of movie too. It's not the way this book developed, but I'm sure that's in there too. And I'll just throw in one other movie, because Jay's talking about that feeling that the director suffuses. Pan's Labyrinth is one of my favorite movies. And the way that took on a real historical situation and somehow made it feel otherworldly, at the same time, is kind of what I'm hoping happens with this book, where you're like, this is a real place. It really happened fictionally. but it's also in a sort of neither world at the same time. I think, Susan, you sort of mentioned that that was the feeling you got from the book. And that's what I'm going for. I can't really think of a better word than irreality.
I like that word. It does describe the book quite well. And
Thanks.
so this, I think, is going to be our last question to give some time to people in the audience to share their questions. But what is the takeaway that you want people to have after they've read your book, after they've seen the film? What is one thing that you really want them to remember and to think about?
Again, I can't give a short answer, but I'll try to be fast because I do think there are three. I mentioned that my first goal was that you put down the book and just like, that was a great book. I was moved. I was affected by it, regardless of the content. So that's one. And I just think there are different audiences. Like if it reaches readers that know nothing about the Holocaust, then, if they just had an inkling of interest in pursuing the facts for themselves, then that would be, I would be humbled and honored by that. And for readers, I've heard from some that know plenty about the Holocaust, didn't necessarily learn anything new, but felt just, I hear the word devastated a lot, but also inspired. So for that audience, I don't know if this is too cliche, but I hope they feel like a little stronger in the places that the book breaks them, because a lot of people they're finding the reading both hard and rewarding.
Thank you. How about you, Jay?
I did come up with the short version because that's the job of the filmmaker. We all grew up with people in the neighborhood who had numbers on their arms, and maybe we had cousins or uncles or grandparents who died in the Holocaust, or who knew people from the town who died. We experienced it as part of someone else's living memory, if not our own. And that connection is broken now. I mean, we're all sitting around waiting for the last victim to die, but it's already gone. The connection that we have, the larger cultural connection to that time, is gone. It's just the few now. So I felt like I needed to lay the groundwork before this movie even starts. And it opens up on a black screen and two titles come up. The Vanishing is a work of fiction, but the Holocaust was real. And then they fade down. And I think if nothing else is taken away from this movie, that's what we need to get across, that this is not a tale we tell. This is something that happened, and it wasn't that long ago.
Thank you both. Your answers were wonderful, and the book is wonderful, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the film. Gabriel, do we have some questions?
Thanks, Susan.
Well, thank you all. It's really interesting to hear the process, and I know I always find it to be an interesting look into where things initiate, and it's interesting to have this conversation now as the book is coming out and Jay is beginning, has been involved and beginning a lot of these determinations and thoughts about how to adapt it and ultimately broaden the reach of the message. So if people in the audience have questions, please do post them and we will answer as many as we can. One that came through is for Jay about, and I know you talked about how you plan to approach it. It will be live. Will there be elements that are kind of animated, and some of those pieces do you intend to use?
No, this is not an animated project, but anything that tackles this kind of material, certainly, and really any film now, is going to have some elements that are animated, but you're never going to be looking at it thinking this is a cartoon. But if, just because of the way we make films right now, they may animate some birds in the background. There will be, in all likelihood, tons of digital sets. There's no version of this movie that is 100% special effect free, but the purpose of the movie and the focus of the movie is never going to be effects.
All right, great, thank you. And I'd like to ask this question for Susan. I know you've used the book in your teaching. Do you have some lessons maybe to share, or how you've approached this book in, you're really actually using it on the front lines of teaching it to people, and how that has been, and the reception you've gotten from it?
I recommend the book for middle school and high school teachers to use with their students. Unfortunately, sometimes the teachers have access to books which are not of the highest quality, and that is the book that the students have as their background to the Holocaust. This book will give them a real view of what the Holocaust experience was. And I think Jay and David both mentioned the fact that one of the things that this book does is it talks about all the different experiences that people had. And that's one of the points that I think is really important in Holocaust education, is that it's not looked at, if you were in the Holocaust, you were in a concentration camp and that's it. People need to know that there were different experiences. There was the partisan experience, there was the ghetto experience, there was the immigration experience. There were all of those things, and this book does a wonderful job of weaving all those things into the story and making it seem like it's something that you could handle. One of the other reasons that I teach about the Holocaust is I want young people to understand that even though they may be exposed to horrible things in their lives, that there is life afterwards, there is hope, they can live through it. And one of the lessons of the Holocaust is exactly that, that people did manage to live through it. They did manage to do the right things. They did help others, no matter what else was going on around them. And those are the things that I want students to be able to pick out of Holocaust education. And this book does a great job of doing that.